In a small, secluded town on the edge of an ancient forest, Emily lived a life that few understood. She worked at the local zoo, and while her responsibilities extended to various animals, her days revolved around one in particular: Koba, a rare and intelligent gorilla who seemed more like a friend than a simple creature in captivity. Emily's connection to Koba was beyond the ordinary bond of caretaker and animal. It was a companionship that defied explanation. She spent hours by his enclosure, feeding him, talking to him, even confiding in him. And somehow Koba appeared to understand her on a level that went beyond human comprehension. Emily's story was one of quiet resilience. She had grown up here in this sleepy town, but had always been somewhat of an outcast. From a young age, she felt a pull towards animals, finding comfort in their silent presence, a steadiness and loyalty she struggled to find in people. Her family had drifted apart, and close friendships were rare, leaving her with a deep seated distrust in human relationships. For Emily, animals were a source of truth and peace. They didn't judge or betray, they existed purely in a way that felt safe to her. This refuge in animals led her to the zoo, a place where she could live out a routine that shielded her from the chaotic and often hurtful human world. She knew every sound and smell, every small change in behavior among the animals she cared for. But Koba was different. There was an unspoken understanding between them, something she could neither rationalize nor ignore. Townsfolk, however, whispered about her peculiar attachment to Koba, noting her tendency to spend hours with him rather than seeking out the company of people. Some even found her bond with the gorilla unsettling, but Emily was long past caring about their opinions. Koba, towering and gentle, often sat quietly, observing her with his deep, dark eyes that seemed to hold a world of wisdom. Emily would sit by his enclosure, sometimes speaking to him about her day, her thoughts, her dreams. It was as if he were her confidant, the only being who truly understood her. On days when the weight of isolation felt heavy, she found comfort in those quiet moments, leaning against the bars, looking into Koba's eyes as if she might find the answers there. Amidst this quiet, solitary life, there was one person who managed to break through Emily's walls. Matt had been her neighbor since childhood, a steadfast presence in her life. Reserved and soft spoken, Matt shared many childhood memories with her. They had spent countless summers exploring the woods, inventing games, and keeping each other company when the world felt too big or too small. But as they grew older, Matt's quiet admiration for Emily had turned into something deeper, something he wasn't quite brave enough to express openly. Even as adults, Matt would visit Emily at the zoo, lending a hand with small tasks or simply sitting with her, his presence a comforting counterbalance to her solitude. His visits were frequent enough that people around town noticed, leading to whispered speculation about their relationship. But to Emily, Matt was just a friend, perhaps the only person she felt she could trust in a limited way, though she sensed his desire for something more. She had grown so used to Matt's quiet loyalty that she hadn't fully grasped the depth of his affection. On one cool autumn afternoon, as golden leaves carpeted the zoo paths, Emily found herself sitting with Matt by Koba's enclosure after hours. The air was tinged with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the usual bustle of the zoo had faded into an evening calm. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the distant calls of animals settling for the night. Matt's voice broke the silence, carrying an edge of vulnerability that caught Emily off guard. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" he asked, his eyes trained on her, searching for a reaction. Emily turned to him, surprised. "Why would I? This is where I belong. Koba and we have this connection." I know it sounds crazy, but it's like he understands me. She chuckled softly, brushing her hair back, but there was an intensity in her words, a conviction that went beyond casual sentiment. Matt fidgeted with a small stone, rolling it between his fingers. I get that, he murmured, glancing away. But sometimes I wonder if you're holding yourself back. You deserve more than just this. His voice trailed off, unable to fully articulate his concern. Emily laughed, shaking her head. You always think I need to go find some grand adventure, but I've had enough of the world out there. I'm content here, Matt. This is enough for me. Her tone was light, but there was a resolute undertone that Matt couldn't ignore. A silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words. Matt fell quiet, his expression unreadable, but Emily sensed his disappointment. She knew he wanted more from her than just friendship, but it was a boundary she wasn't prepared to cross. For Emily, life with animals, particularly with Koba, was simpler, safer. The world of human relationships was a complex, often painful maze she had no desire to navigate again. That evening, as they locked up the zoo together, Matt's hand brushed hers accidentally, and Emily felt a brief flicker of something a tension, a hesitation that seemed to carry more weight than she wanted to acknowledge. She quickly withdrew her hand, forcing a smile and pretending not to notice that she could sense the subtle shift in Matt's demeanor. After Matt left, Emily found herself lingering by Koba's enclosure, drawn to his calm presence as she often was. The gorilla sat on the far side, watching her with those steady, soulful eyes. There was a strange comfort in his gaze, a silent companionship that Matt, for all his loyalty, couldn't quite provide. She spoke to Koba softly, voicing thoughts she couldn't share with anyone else. It was in these quiet moments that she felt her connection with Koba most strongly, as if he understood her solitude and embraced it, something no human could fully comprehend. Days turned into weeks, and Emily found herself relying on Koba's presence more and more, the quiet refuge he offered soothing her in ways that even Matt's visits could not. She began to notice subtle changes in Matt's behavior. His visits became more frequent, his gestures more lingering, and the way he looked at her carried a quiet urgency. Rumors about their relationship started circulating in the town, but Emily dismissed them unaffected by the gossip. Still, she sensed Matt's growing frustration, a silent ache that he tried to hide but couldn't entirely suppress. And she, too, felt a faint stirring of guilt and awareness that perhaps she was clinging to her routines and her connection with Koba as a way to shield herself from emotions she wasn't ready to face. Emily's world was slowly shifting, and although she tried to ignore it, the lines between her affection for Koba and her friendship with Matt began to blur. And her friendship with Matt began to blur. She was unaware, however, that this quiet life she had built was about to be irrevocably altered, leading her into a journey of conflict, heartbreak, and ultimately self discovery. The sense of safety she had always found in her routines and her bond with Koba was on the brink of unraveling, and she would soon be forced to confront choices that would test the very fabric of her beliefs and desires. Emily's quiet life at the zoo continued, but something had shifted after Matt's subtle declaration of concern. While she tried to brush off his words, a seed of doubt had been planted. In the days that followed, Matt's presence took on a different weight in her life. She sensed his attempts to bridge the gap between them, his silent hope that she would reciprocate his feelings. However, Emily remained focused on her work and on Koba, whose familiar companionship was a source of stability she wasn't ready to relinquish. Despite her determination to keep things the same, the townsfolk's gossip grew louder. People began to notice the hours Emily spent with Koba and her reserved behavior around everyone else, especially Matt. Whispers about her obsession with the gorilla floated through the town, painting Emily as eccentric, even strange. For most of her life, she had ignored such judgments, but now she found herself questioning whether there was some truth in them. Matt's visits became more frequent, each one filled with small, thoughtful gestures. He would bring her coffee, linger after closing hours, and help with tasks that he already knew by heart. He'd offer quiet encouragement, all while trying to catch glimpses of her heart through her resolute exterior. Emily sensed his longing but struggled to acknowledge it, feeling guilty yet unwilling to let him in. One evening, Matt brought her a small bouquet of wildflowers, his gaze warm yet questioning as he handed them to her. "Thought you might like these. They reminded me of you," he said softly. Emily accepted them with a smile, but there was an awkwardness in her response, an unspoken wall between them. She thanked him, yet couldn't shake the feeling that she was leading him on. His attention was comforting, but it wasn't something she could return in the way he wanted. Meanwhile, her connection to Koba only intensified. She spent long hours in his enclosure, speaking to him, finding solace in his steady gaze. With Koba, there was no judgment, no hidden motives, only a silent understanding. Koba, with his dark, thoughtful eyes, seemed to sense her inner turmoil, his gaze offering her a quiet refuge that was free of the complexities of human relationship. One day, after Matt's persistent visits and townspeople's speculative glances had grown unbearable, he confronted her in a way he never had before. They were alone near Koba's enclosure, the fading daylight casting shadows across his face. Emily could see a blend of frustration and yearning in his expression, emotions he had carefully concealed until now. "Emily, I don't understand why you're keeping me at arm's length," he said, his voice laced with restrained hurt. "You trust Koba, an animal with everything. But you can't seem to trust me, a person who's been here for you since the beginning." She turned away, feeling a pang of guilt but also a defensive urge to protect herself. "Matt, it's not about trust, it's complicated. Koba and we have a connection that's hard to explain. He's always been there for me in a way that people haven't." Matt's shoulders sagged, but he didn't relent. "I get that Koba means a lot to you, but at some point, Emily, you have to let people in. You deserve more than just this solitary life talking to animals." "I'm here, waiting, and I'm trying. But it feels like you're shutting me out." The vulnerability in his voice tugged at her, but she forced herself to stay firm. "Matt, I appreciate everything you do, but I'm happy here. This is enough for me." "You're asking for something I don't think I can give." A tense silence followed, and for the first time, the distance between them felt insurmountable. Matt looked down, disappointment etched in his face, and without another word, he walked away, leaving Emily feeling both relieved and heartbroken. She sensed she was pushing him away, yet she couldn't bring herself to break free from the comfort of her routine and her connection with Koba. As the days passed, Matt's visits became less frequent, and when he did visit, his once warm gestures were tainted with a quiet reserve. Emily felt his absence acutely but couldn't bring herself to confront the deeper reasons for her behavior. Instead, she buried herself even further in her work with Koba, drawing closer to him in an attempt to fill the growing void. But the strain of her relationship with Matt didn't go unnoticed by the townsfolk. They watched her with a blend of curiosity and judgment, whispering about her attachment to Koba and speculating about her rejection of Matt. Emily had grown accustomed to isolation, but now the loneliness weighed on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She felt trapped between her loyalty to Koba and a growing, nagging sense of guilt about Matt. One night, while sitting alone in her small apartment, Emily felt the weight of it all. She thought about Matt, about the kindness and patience he had shown her, about his unwavering presence in her life. Yet every time she imagined letting him into her heart fully, a sense of panic overtook her. She knew the hurt that came with trusting people, and her bond with Koba felt safe, unbreakable. Still, she couldn't ignore the lingering question in her mind. Was she truly living, or was she merely hiding from the world, using Koba as her sanctuary? Just as her mind grew restless with these questions, a rumor began circulating in town, a rumor that Emily was obsessed with Koba, that her connection with him went beyond reason. People's speculation turned from mild curiosity to outright suspicion, and she became a subject of whispered gossip. The thought that her attachment to Koba might be seen as unnatural weighed heavily on her, intensifying the loneliness she was already feeling. During this time, Emily started feeling unwell, plagued by bouts of dizziness and fatigue that she couldn't quite explain. Dismissing them as stress related, she continued to immerse herself in her work, avoiding any consideration of her physical state. But the sense of something being wrong lingered, an underlying tension that she couldn't shake. Then, on a rare evening when she and Matt crossed paths at the zoo, she noticed an unusual coldness in his demeanor. Matt, who had once filled the space between them with quiet warmth, now seemed distant, guarded. It was a shift she hadn't anticipated, and it unsettled her deeply. She longed to reach out, to bridge the growing divide, but pride and fear held her back. Instead, she retreated further into her routine, into Koba's silent companionship, seeking refuge in the familiar as the world around her grew increasingly alienating. Emily was blind to the storm brewing in her life, unaware that her reluctance to confront her emotions was setting her on a path toward irreversible consequences. Each visit to Koba's enclosure brought her comfort, yet it was a comfort tinged with a vague, unsettling feeling she couldn't quite name. Even as she tried to maintain her solitary peace, the undercurrents of tension between her, Matt, and the judgmental eyes of the town were pulling her toward a conflict she could no longer ignore. As winter approached and the town became cloaked in a blanket of quiet, Emily felt the isolation setting even deeper. She sensed something changing both within herself and in her relationships, and while part of her clung to her routine, another part grew uneasy. The life she had built, once so safe and predictable, was slipping through her fingers, and she found herself standing on the precipice of choices she wasn't ready to make. Little did Emily know, the decisions she avoided were leading her down a path that would soon force her to confront everything she had been running from her fear of intimacy. And the complex entanglements that had ground her and. In her quest to preserve her sanctuary, she had unknowingly begun the slow unraveling of her own world. As she left the clinic, Emily felt a deep unease settle over her. Desperate for answers, she tried to retrace her recent steps, seeking any explanation. Memories of her time with Koba surfaced in her mind, each moment spent in his enclosure now carrying an eerie undertone. An absurd, irrational thought crept into her mind. Could her close proximity to him have somehow affected her? She knew it was impossible, yet the question lingered, filling her with a mixture of fear and paranoia. Haunted by these thoughts, Emily became withdrawn, avoiding the zoo staff and isolating herself even further. She stopped seeing Matt altogether, finding herself unable to confront him amidst her confusion. Each day she returned to Koba's enclosure, seeking solace in his familiar presence. But even there, she felt a growing unease, a subtle shift in her perception of their bond. What had once been a source of comfort now felt tainted by doubt, by a strange sense of vulnerability she couldn't shake. The townsfolk began to notice her absence from her usual routines, and whispers of her condition spread like wildfire. People speculated about her health, her increasingly eccentric behavior, and her obsessive attachment to Koba. The rumors only intensified her isolation, pushing her further into the shadows of her life. Emily found herself caught between shame and desperation, unsure of how to cope with the overwhelming emotions welling up inside her. Days passed in a haze of confusion, and Emily continued to spiral, torn between her loyalty to Koba and the unsettling realization of her own condition. Finally, unable to bear the weight of her secret alone, she sought out Matt. She waited outside his small apartment, hesitating before knocking, uncertain of what she hoped to gain from the encounter. When he opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to concern as he took in her weary appearance. Emily, is everything okay? He asked, his voice filled with a tenderness that only deepened her guilt. She swallowed, unsure of where to begin. Matt, I don't know how to say this, but I'm pregnant. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Matt's expression was unreadable. Then a flicker of hurt crossed his face, quickly masked by a forced calm. Dang, didn't know you were seeing anyone? Emily shook her head, frustration and confusion boiling over. I'm not. That's the thing, I haven't been with anyone. I don't understand how this happened. Matt's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion mingling with disbelief. Are you sure? He asked, his tone cautious but skeptical. Yes, she replied, feeling her cheeks flush. I don't expect you to understand, but this is the truth. I'm terrified. Matt, I don't know what to think or feel anymore. A tense silence filled the room as Matt processed her words. Slowly, a shadow crossed his expression, and he looked away, avoiding her gaze. Emily, you spend more time with that gorilla than anyone else. People are starting to wonder. Her relationship with Matt, once a source of stability, was now strained beyond recognition. She had alienated the one person who had always been there for her, and in doing so, had lost her last connection to the world outside the zoo. Alone with Koba, she tried to find solace in their bond, but even that was tainted by doubt and uncertainty. One cold, silent night, as Emily closed up the zoo, she felt a wave of desperation wash over her. She didn't know how much longer she could continue like this, caught between her fears and the crushing weight of loneliness. For the first time, she questioned whether her connection to Koba, her refuge from a painful world, was ultimately a cage of her own making. In that moment, Emily realized she had reached a breaking point. The life she had carefully built was slipping away, and the only path forward was one that would force her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. Her journey, once a search for solace and connection, was now a tangled mess of conflicting emotions, and she was left with no choice but to face the fallout of her choices and the painful reality of her solitude. The realization that she had reached a breaking point lingered in Emily's mind, but she struggled to take action. Days passed in a fog of confusion, loneliness, and fear, leaving her feeling trapped and powerless. The whispers around town grew louder, fueling her isolation, and even the zoo staff had begun to watch her with thinly veiled suspicion. Every glance seemed loaded with judgment, and Emily found herself shrinking away from human interaction altogether. Haunted by her encounter with Matt and the impossible reality of her pregnancy, Emily's mental state continued to deteriorate. Her once steady connection to Koba had become her only comfort, but even that now felt fragile, tainted by the weight of the situation she faced. Her body ached with exhaustion, and her thoughts grew darker as she spent each day moving through her duties in a daze consumed by fear and a lingering sense of betrayal from the one friend she had trusted. As she reached the end of another long, cold day at the zoo, Emily found herself standing alone by Koba's enclosure. Shadows stretched across the ground as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the zoo. She watched Koba's movements, the familiar rise and fall of his powerful body as he rested, and felt a pang of desperation. She realized that she could no longer ignore the growing storm inside her. She needed answers. The next day, in a moment of resolve, Emily decided to confront Matt one last time. She hadn't seen him since their tense conversation about her pregnancy, and though the thought of facing him filled her with dread, she knew she couldn't continue living in this limo. She needed to know if he had any part in the turmoil that had engulfed her life. When she arrived at Matt's apartment, her heart raced as she knocked on the door. A long moment passed before he answered, his expression guarded as he looked at her. Emily took a steadying breath, willing herself to remain composed. Matt, I need to talk to you, she said, her voice strained. I can't keep doing this living with these doubts, these questions. I need to know if you had anything to do with what's happening to me. Matt's face hardened, a flash of guilt flickering in his eyes before he quickly masked it. Emily, I don't know what you're talking about. She searched his face, her voice growing sharper. I don't understand how any of this is possible. I haven't been with anyone, Matt, and yet I'm pregnant. I'm pregnant, the only person I've trusted, the only person I thought would never hurt me is you. For a moment, he looked away, his jaw clenched. When he finally met her gaze, there was a coldness in his eyes that she had never seen before. You've been so wrapped up in that gorilla, he began, his voice laced with bitterness. Did you ever stop to think about how I felt? Watching you ignore me, pouring all your affection into an animal while I stood by, waiting for you to see me. Emily's heart pounded, a chill running down her spine as his words stirred. What? What are you saying, Matt? Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. A twisted smile played at the corners of his mouth. Maybe this is your fault, Emily. Harry. Maybe if you hadn't been so obsessed with that gorilla, things would be different. The realization of what he was implying hit her like a blow, and she stumbled back, feeling sick, feeling sick. A wave of nausea and betrayal washed over her as she grasped the full extent of his words. She had trusted him, confided in him, allowed him into her world, and he had taken advantage of that trust in the most unforgivable way. Without another word, Emily turned and fled from his apartment, her mind reeling. The betrayal was like a physical wound, a pain that cut deep, leaving her gasping for breath as she stumbled through the cold night air. Her world had shattered, and every step away from his apartment felt like a plunge into darkness. In the days that followed, Emily withdrew completely, avoiding everyone and everything familiar. The zoo became both a refuge and a prison, a place where she could hide from the world but not from the pain that gnawed at her. Even her bond with Koba, once her greatest source of solace, now felt tainted. She found herself avoiding his enclosure, unable to face the memories of the trust and safety she once found there. But Koba sensed her distress. Each time she walked past his enclosure, his dark eyes followed her, filled with a silent concern that only deepened her sorrow. Emily longed to confide in him, to find comfort in his steady presence, but the betrayal she had endured had left her raw and guarded, unable to trust even the most loyal companion in her life. One evening, as Emily sat alone in her small apartment, she reached her breaking point. She couldn't continue living in this limo, haunted by what Matt had done, burdened by the reality of her condition. The pain, anger, and sorrow that had built up over the weeks exploded, and she knew she had to make a choice to either let the betrayal consume her or to find a way to reclaim her life. With a newfound resolve, Emily returned to the zoo the next day, determined to put the past behind her. She approached her supervisor and requested a leave of absence, explaining that she needed time to sort through her personal struggles. Her supervisor, who had noticed her declining health and erratic behavior, agreed without hesitation, offering her the support she had been too proud to seek before. Emily then went to Koba's enclosure one last time. Standing by the familiar bars, she let herself look into his eyes, allowing the connection she had suppressed for so long to surface. The pain and sadness in his gaze mirrored her own, and for a moment she felt a flicker of peace amidst the storm. I'm leaving for a while, Koba, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But I promise I'll be back. I just need time to heal. Koba's gentle gaze followed her as she turned and walked away, the weight of her decision settling over her like a heavy cloak. As she left the zoo, Emily felt a mixture of sorrow and relief, knowing that she was finally taking steps to rebuild her life. In the following weeks, Emily retreated from the world, spending time in solitude to heal from the betrayal she had endured. She reached out to distant friends, rekindling connections she had long neglected, finding comfort in the support of those who had once been part of her life. Gradually, she began to rediscover a sense of purpose and strength, realizing that her identity was not defined by her pain or her attachment to Koba, but by her resilience and her capacity to heal. Emily's journey was far from easy, but as winter gave way to spring, she felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew that her bond with Koba would always hold a special place in her heart, but she no longer saw it as a crutch or a refuge from the world. Instead, it became a reminder of the strength she had found within herself, a testament to her ability to overcome even the darkest of betrayals. One warm spring evening, Emily returned to the zoo to bid farewell to her supervisor and the animals she had cared for. As she walked through the familiar grounds, she felt a sense of closure, a peace she hadn't known in months. When she reached Koba's enclosure, he looked at her with a quiet understanding, as if sensing that this was goodbye. "I'm going to be okay, Koba," she said softly, her heart full of gratitude for the years they had shared. "Thank you for everything." As she left the zoo for the final time, Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She was ready to move forward, to build a new life free from the shadows of her past. The scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer held her captive. She had reclaimed her strength, her identity, and her freedom, ready to face whatever the future held with open arms. Emily's decision to leave the zoo marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, yet the journey was far from simple. The betrayal she had endured left deep emotional scars, and even though she had physically left the painful memories behind, her mind remained burdened by the past. Each day was a challenge as she grappled with the conflicting emotions that lingered: anger, sorrow, regret, and a yearning for closure. However, she knew she could no longer retreat into solitude. She had to rebuild herself and her life. After her departure from the zoo, Emily moved to a nearby town, far enough to distance herself from the whispers of the townsfolk, but close enough to keep a sense of familiarity. She rented a small, quiet apartment, filling it with simple comforts that reminded her of the peace she had once felt in Koba's presence. She spent her days establishing a new routine, one centered around healing and self discovery. Gradually, Emily reconnected with old friends and family members she had neglected over the years. The initial conversations were awkward, marked by long silences and tentative questions, but as days turned into weeks, she began to feel a sense of warmth and connection that she had thought was lost forever. Her friends, sensing her fragility, offered gentle support without pressing her to reveal more than she was ready to share. With time, Emily found herself opening up, allowing the people around her to understand the struggles she had faced and the strength she had gained in the process. Her healing process wasn't linear. Some days she felt resilient, ready to embrace a new path. Other days, the weight of her experiences returned, reminding her of the hurt she had endured. But Emily took each day as it came, focusing on the progress she was making rather than the setback. Slowly, she regained the confidence to reclaim parts of herself that she had long suppressed: her sense of humor, her creativity, her curiosity about the world beyond her limited routines. One afternoon, Emily received an unexpected message from her former supervisor at the zoo. He informed her about a new conservation project that was being organized, one that would focus on rehabilitating rescued animals in their natural habitat. The project was ambitious, involving a team of dedicated professionals working across various wildlife reserves. To her surprise, the team had specifically requested her expertise, impressed by her dedication and years of experience working with Koba and other animals. The invitation stirred a mix of excitement and trepidation within Emily. The project represented an opportunity to use her skills in a way that could make a real difference, yet it also meant stepping into an environment that would challenge her emotionally and physically. She wondered if she was ready to embrace this new path, to work with animals once again, but without the protective walls of the zoo. After days of reflection, Emily decided to accept the offer. She realized that this project could be the closure she needed, a chance to reestablish her connection with animals on her own terms, free from the emotional burdens that had once clouded her relationship with Koba. The thought of contributing to something meaningful filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months, and she felt ready to move forward, carrying the lessons of her past with her. Emily's new role involved traveling between wildlife reserves, assessing animals that had been rescued from captivity and preparing them for reintroduction habitats. The work was challenging, often exhausting, but it filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Each animal she encountered reminded her of Koba, of the bond they had shared, yet she no longer felt confined by that memory. Instead, it became a source of strength, a reminder of her resilience and her capacity to love and protect. As the months went by, Emily found herself immersed in the beauty and complexity of the natural world. She worked alongside a team of compassionate individuals who shared her dedication, and the camaraderie she experienced with them helped her find balance between her solitude and her desire for human connection. These people became like family or shared goals and experiences, binding them in a way that felt natural and genuine. She no longer felt the intense need to isolate herself. Instead, she found herself opening up, laughing, and learning to trust again. One day, while working at a reserve, Emily encountered a young gorilla that had been rescued from illegal captivity. The gorilla's dark, inquisitive eyes reminded her so much of Koba that she felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with a profound sense of peace. She knelt down, speaking to the gorilla in the same gentle, reassuring tone she had once used with Koba. In that moment, she felt a connection pure and unburdened by the pain of her past. The encounter marked a turning point for Emily. She realized that she could honor her bond with Koba without letting it define her or hold her back. Her experiences, though painful, had shaped her into a stronger, more compassionate person, capable of embracing new connections and finding joy in her work. Emily continued to thrive in her role, her confidence growing with each day. She embraced the challenges that came with rehabilitating animals, knowing that her work was making a difference. The once fresh wounds of betrayal and isolation had faded into scars, reminders of her journey, but no longer sources of pain. She carried them with quiet pride, understanding that they were a testament to her resilience and her ability to heal. As her journey in wildlife conservation continued, Emily found herself reflecting on the lesson she had learned. She had once believed that she needed to isolate herself to find peace, that animals were her only sanctuary. But now she understood that true peace came from embracing life in all its complexity, from opening her heart to both the quiet companionship of animals and the warmth of human connection. Months turned into a year, and Emily felt ready to visit her old town, to return to the zoo and bid a proper farewell to the place where she had spent so much of her life. She walked through the familiar gates, feeling a sense of closure as she made her way to Koba's enclosure one last time. The space was empty now, Koba having been moved to a larger sanctuary where he could live among his own kind, a decision she had supported before her departure. Standing by the enclosure, Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She whispered a quiet goodbye, thanking Koba for the years of companionship, for the solace he had given her when she needed it most. She knew that she would carry the memories of her time with him, but they no longer held her back. Instead, they became a part of her story, a foundation upon which she had rebuilt her life. As she left the zoo for the final time, Emily felt a lightness in her heart. She had come full circle, transforming the pain and betrayal of her past into strength and purpose. She was no longer defined by her isolation or her attachment to a single creature. She had found her place in a larger world, a world filled with meaning and connection. Returning to her work at the wildlife reserves, Emily felt a renewed sense of clarity. The challenges she faced each day no longer intimidated her, for she knew that she had overcome far greater obstacles. Her journey had taught her that healing was not a destination, but a continuous process, one that required courage, compassion, and the willingness to move forward despite the scars left behind. Emily's life became a testament to resilience, a story of transformation shaped by both human and animal connections. She had found her way through the darkness, emerging stronger and more complete, ready to face whatever the future held with a quiet confidence and an open heart. The memories of Koba, Matt, and her time at the zoo would always remain with her, but they were no longer shadows of her past. They were the building blocks of a life redefined, a life embraced in its entirety. As the sun set over the reserve one evening, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Emily stood by the edge of a tranquil lake, watching the world around her settle into calm. She felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet joy that had been hard won, yet entirely her own. She knew at last that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As Emily continued her work with the Wildlife Conservation Project, she felt a sense of accomplishment and belonging that had once seemed impossible. Her journey of healing and rediscovery had taken her to places she never imagined, and the daily challenges she faced in rehabilitating animals filled her with purpose. The people around her became trusted allies, and together they shared the highs and lows of their work, each day drawing Emily closer to a life filled with both quiet companionship and human connection. In the year since she left her old life behind, Emily had grown profoundly. Emily had grown profoundly. The pain and betrayal of her past, while no longer raw, had shaped her, giving her a resilience that guided her through every experience. She had learned to accept both her love for animals and her capacity to connect with people, understanding now that these relationships didn't have to be mutually exclusive. With each day, she found herself letting go of the fears and doubts that had once confined her. One day, her supervisor approached her with an invitation to lead a new, expansive project, a rescue and rehabilitation center for gorillas who had been displaced due to habitat loss. The center would require a seasoned expert to oversee the animal's transition from captivity to a more natural setting, ensuring they could adapt and hopefully reintegrate into the wild. The offer was both an honor and a challenge, and Emily felt an immediate connection to the project. She realized it could be the culmination of everything she had learned, a chance to give back and create something lasting. Accepting the position, Emily threw herself into the work, overseeing the construction of the new facility and forming a dedicated team to support her. The project demanded her full attention, and as she poured her energy into building this new sanctuary, she felt the last remnants of her former life slipping away. She was no longer bound by her past, no longer haunted by the choices she had once made. Her work became a testament to her journey, a tangible way to honor the bond she had once shared with Koba and the strength she had found in herself. The sanctuary was soon filled with gorillas, many of them bearing scars from their past lives. Emily saw pieces of herself in each of them, creatures who had known confinement, loss, and betrayal, yet now had a chance to rebuild and rediscover. She worked closely with them, forming bonds through careful observation and gentle interactions, guiding them through their adjustment to a world outside captivity. Over time, she watched as they grew stronger, more confident, each one adapting to the freedom they had once been denied. One evening, as she was making her rounds, Emily encountered a young gorilla who had recently arrived at the sanctuary. The gorilla's gaze was wary, her movements tentative as she explored her new environment. Emily knelt a short distance away, extending her hand in a gesture of trust, The gorilla paused, studying. In that moment, Emily felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. She realized that her bond with Koba had not only been a source of solace in her darkest times, but had also laid the foundation for the work she was doing now. She was no longer clinging to the past. Instead, she was honoring it by using her experience to help others, both animals and people, find a new beginning. She had turned her pain into a purpose, creating a space for healing and growth. Just as she had found for herself, months passed, and the sanctuary flourished under Emily's leadership. She became known not only for her dedication, but also for her empathetic approach to rehabilitation. Her team admired her resilience and the quiet strength with which she led, and many of them came to see her as a mentor, learning from her journey as much as from her expertise. Emily embraced her role, grateful for the opportunity to guide others on their own paths of discovery and healing. A break one day, she took a walk along the edge of the sanctuary, reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point. She thought of the small, secluded town she had left behind, the painful memories she had shed, and the friendships she had rekindled. She knew that without each of these experiences, she wouldn't be the person she was today, a person capable of both deep connection and independence, unafraid to face the challenges of life head on. Emily's journey had brought her full circle from a life defined by solitude and isolation to one rich with purpose and community. She was no longer the woman who hid behind routines, who clung to one bond out of fear of facing the world. She had transformed, her spirit strengthened by the trials she had endured, her heart open to the possibilities that lay before her one crisp autumn afternoon. As she prepared to close the sanctuary for the day, a visitor arrived, a friend from her past. To her surprise, it was one of the staff members from the zoo, someone who had known her during her years with Koba. They spoke for a while, catching up on the changes in both of their lives. Her friend mentioned that Koba was doing well, thriving in a larger, more natural setting where he had formed bonds with other gorillas. Emily felt a bittersweet happiness at the news, grateful to know he had found peace in a place where he could live freely, surrounded by his own kind. As she listened, she realized that Koba's journey was not unlike her own. They had both found solace in each other during a time of loneliness and isolation, but they had also found the strength to move beyond that chapter, each embarking on a path toward a more fulfilling life. The thought brought her comfort, a reminder that every ending carried the seeds of a new beginning. As the sun set over the sanctuary that evening, Emily took a moment to herself, standing by the edge of a peaceful lake that mirrored the changing colors of the sky. She closed her eyes, breathing in the crisp autumn air, feeling a quiet joy settle over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole, her past no longer a source of pain, but a story of resilience, growth, and transformation. With a renewed sense of purpose, Emily returned to the sanctuary, ready to continue the work that had come to define her life. She knew that the journey ahead would bring new challenges, but she also knew that she was ready to face them, her heart open and her spirit unbroken. She had reclaimed her identity, her strength, and her future, and she was prepared to embrace whatever lay ahead with courage and grace. The scars of her past would always remain, subtle reminders of the path she had walked. But they no longer held her back. Instead, they served as testaments to the strength she had found within herself. She had learned to balance the quiet companionship of animals with the warmth of human connection, creating a life that honored both aspects of her soul. Emily's journey was complete, yet it was only just beginning. She had found her place in the world, a place where she could make a difference, where she could continue to grow and thrive. And as she looked toward the horizon, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the pain that had shaped her, the connections that had sustained her, and the future that awaited her, full of promise and light. In the fading light of day, she whispered a silent thank you to Koba, to the sanctuary she had built, and to the person she had become. Her heart was filled with peace, her spirit unburdened, as she walked back to the life she had created, a life defined not by the shadows of her past, but by the strength and resilience she carried into her future.